Imagine the moment of relief when a fragile life enters the world too soon, but hope persists because of the care and expertise in a neonatal intensive care unit, a place designed to protect and heal. Now imagine that very place transforming into a house of horrors. 7 infants, each born prematurely and fighting for their lives, suffered injuries so severe, it left their families and the medical community searching for answers. Tiny limbs, meant to grow and thrive, were instead broken, shattered by deliberate acts of violence. How could such a tragedy go unnoticed for so long in a modern hospital? Who was behind these monstrous acts, and why? This is the story of Erin Strotman, a nurse who was supposed to provide care but now stands accused of inflicting unimaginable harm on the most vulnerable. But is this just about one individual? Or does it speak to a deeper systemic issue, one that intertwines medical malpractice, racial bias, and the failures of oversight? Before we dive into the facts, consider this. What does it say about a society when even the most defenseless, premature newborns are not safe from harm? Stay with us as we unravel the chilling details of a case that has shocked families, shattered trust, and forced a community to ask hard questions about justice, race, and the very institutions meant to protect us. Henrico Children's Hospital in Richmond was a place of hope and heartbreak, a sanctuary for the most fragile lives. The Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, or NICU, was where premature babies, some born as early as 28 weeks, were given a fighting chance. But as parents placed their trust in the nurses and doctors to protect their children, something unthinkable was happening behind closed doors. 7 infants, tiny, helpless, and already struggling to survive, were found with fractured bones. Imagine this. The arm of a newborn, barely thicker than an adult's finger, snapped like a dry twig. Their femurs, which are supposed to be the strongest bones in the body, cracked. For these tiny beings, every movement, even the simple act of being cradled, became a source of unbearable pain. Think about the worst pain you've ever experienced. A broken bone, perhaps, or a severe sprain. Now imagine enduring that without the ability to cry out in words, to point to where it hurts, or even to understand why you're in agony. That's what these infants endured. Every time they moved, every time a nurse adjusted their position or changed a diaper, it must have felt like being stabbed with needles all over their tiny bodies. The story might have remained buried if not for one brave grandmother, herself a retired NICU nurse. Her grandson, Noah, was born prematurely at just 28 weeks. After weeks of watching him fight for his life, the family was finally seeing progress. But then, out of nowhere, a nurse mentioned Noah had a fractured leg. The grandmother's instincts kicked in immediately. She knew fractures like this don't just happen. Babies' bones, even those of premature infants, are surprisingly pliable. They bend before they break. For a fracture to occur, significant force must be applied. She began asking questions. How did it happen? Why hadn't anyone noticed earlier? Her questions weren't met with answers, but with silence and vague explanations. The hospital claimed the fracture might have been caused by routine medical care. A rough injection, perhaps. But anyone familiar with neonatal care knows this explanation doesn't hold up. And yet, the hospital hesitated. No alarms were raised. No investigations were launched. Families were told it was a tragic but isolated incident. But it wasn't. Over the next few months, more infants in the NICU began showing similar injuries. Arms, legs, ribs all broken. 7 babies in total, each one fighting not only for survival but now also against pain no newborn should ever experience. And one troubling pattern emerged. The majority of these injured infants were black. To understand the pain these babies felt, consider this: breaking a femur, even in an adult, is considered one of the most excruciating injuries. It's the kind of pain that can make a grown person scream uncontrollably. For a newborn, whose pain threshold is far lower, it would have been unbearable. Every breath, every twitch of a muscle, would have sent waves of agony through their tiny bodies. And unlike adults, these babies had no way to communicate their suffering. Their cries, if they had the strength to cry at all, were dismissed as normal for their condition. The grandmother's report should have been a turning point. It should have sparked an immediate investigation. But instead, the hospital delayed, brushed it off, and allowed more babies to suffer. The question remains, was this hesitation out of negligence, or was there something more sinister at play? As we dig deeper, we'll uncover the shocking truth. The truth behind the unexplained injuries at Henrico Children's Hospital began to unravel in late 2024, nearly a year after the first fractures were discovered. By then, the cases had grown too numerous to ignore. Parents were demanding answers, the media was starting to take notice, and the hospital finally launched a full-scale investigation. It was a race against time. A race to find out who was inflicting unspeakable pain on these helpless babies before another child became a victim. Investigators sifted through months of patient files, medical charts, and injury reports. The task was monumental, with hundreds of hours of surveillance footage from the NICU to comb through. Each video was scrutinized frame by frame, searching for even the smallest sign of misconduct. Then the breakthrough came. In multiple instances, the same nurse appeared in the footage around the time injuries were discovered, Erin Elizabeth and Strotman. At first glance, she was an unlikely suspect. Only 26 years old, Strotman had been a registered nurse since 2019. She had no criminal record, no history of misconduct, and, on paper, seemed to be a dedicated professional. But the surveillance told a different story. Strotman could often be seen entering the NICU at odd hours, lingering by the incubators of vulnerable infants, sometimes staying out of view of the cameras for extended periods. What was she doing during those moments? Investigators couldn't say for certain, but the pattern was undeniable. Every time Strotman was on duty, another infant seemed to suffer, uncovering suspicious behavior. Interviews with hospital staff painted an even more troubling picture. Some colleagues described Strotman as quiet, reserved, and hard to read. Others mentioned subtle red flags. She often volunteered for shifts with the most critical patients but avoided teamwork and oversight. She reportedly downplayed concerns raised by other nurses and dismissed cries of pain from infants as normal reactions. One coworker recalled an incident where Strotman seemed almost indifferent to a baby's obvious distress during a routine check. Another remembered her reacting with visible annoyance when parents asked too many questions. These behaviors, while subtle, added up to a portrait of someone who may have harbored a disturbing detachment from her role as a caregiver. As investigators pieced together the timeline, more damning evidence emerged. Medical records revealed inconsistencies in how injuries were reported. On several occasions, Strotman claimed that fractures occurred during routine procedures, like handling or injections. But neonatal experts reviewing the cases disagreed, stating that such injuries required far more force than what routine care would involve. And then came the testimony of the grandmother who had first raised the alarm. Her persistence in questioning the hospital's actions and inactions provided a crucial turning point. It was her insistence that brought attention back to the surveillance footage and ultimately pointed the finger at Strotman. The victims shared a common thread that couldn't be ignored. Most of the injured babies were black. Could this have been a case of medical racism? The possibility added another layer of urgency to the investigation. Experts pointed to data showing how black patients, even as infants, are more likely to face biased treatment in healthcare settings. This wasn't just about individual actions. It hinted at a deeper, systemic problem. As evidence mounted against Erin Strotman, the case seemed close to resolution. But one question loomed larger than all the others. Why? Why would a nurse, someone sworn to care and protect, turn into the very source of harm? As investigators pieced together Erin Strotman's disturbing actions, an undeniable pattern began to emerge, one that could not be dismissed as coincidence or circumstance. Among her victims, a disproportionate number were black infants. This statistic loomed large, casting a grim shadow over the case and forcing authorities and the community to confront a chilling possibility. Were these crimes driven by racial bias? This was not an isolated incident. To understand the full weight of what happened, one must look at the broader history of medical racism. A history stained with systemic neglect, implicit bias, and outright cruelty. For families of the victims, the racial disparities in this case were not a revelation. They were a painful reminder of a healthcare system that has often failed Black lives, from birth to death. Among the 7 babies harmed in Henrico Children's Hospital's NICU, 5 were Black. Investigators struggled to explain this glaring imbalance. Was it random, or was it a deliberate choice by Erin Strotman? Staff interviews revealed troubling details. Some nurses noticed that Strotman seemed less attentive to babies of color, often delaying their care or dismissing their cries of distress. One coworker recalled a comment Strotman made about how certain babies were more trouble than they're worth. While these remarks were initially brushed off as unprofessional banter, in hindsight, they hinted at something much darker. Strotman's actions fit into a larger, deeply troubling narrative. Black infants in the United States face higher rates of neglect and worse outcomes than their white counterparts. According to the CDC, Black babies are more than twice as likely to die before their first birthday compared to white infants. The March of Dimes reports that Black mothers are 1.5 times more likely to deliver prematurely, and their children are far more likely to experience complications during and after birth. This is not just about socioeconomic status. Implicit bias in medical settings has been extensively documented. A 2016 study found that half of medical students surveyed believed falsehoods like, Black patients have thicker skin, or Black people feel less pain. These misconceptions directly impact care, leading to delayed diagnoses, inadequate treatment, and preventable deaths. The story of Erin Strotman is not without precedent. History is littered with cases where Black patients were targeted or neglected within the healthcare system. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1932 to 1972, for 40 years, Black men in Alabama were left untreated for syphilis, even after penicillin was proven effective, as part of a government experiment. The case of Henrietta Lacks, 1951, a Black woman whose cancer cells were taken without her consent and used for groundbreaking research. Yet her family saw no compensation or acknowledgement for decades. Segregated hospitals. Before the civil rights movement, Black patients were often turned away from white hospitals, forced to rely on underfunded facilities that provided substandard care. Even today, implicit bias continues to manifest in subtle but deadly ways, especially in neonatal care. Studies show that Black babies are 3 times more likely to survive if cared for by Black doctors rather than white ones. Highlighting the impact of racial bias on outcomes, Dr. Marsha Williams, a leading neonatologist, explained the unique vulnerabilities of Black infants in NICUs. Premature babies require constant monitoring and the utmost care. Even small mistakes can have lifelong consequences. For Black infants, those mistakes are compounded by systemic inequities in the healthcare system, inequities that start before birth and continue throughout their lives. The bias isn't always overt. It often shows up in subtle ways. A nurse taking longer to respond to a Black baby's cry, medical professionals assuming that Black parents are less informed or less engaged, or hospital policies that unintentionally disadvantage families of color. For the families of Strotman's victims, the racial disparities were obvious and enraging. Dominique Hakey, the father of one of the injured infants, expressed the pain and frustration felt by many. "You can't look at what happened and not see race," he said. "It's not just about what she did, it's about how the system let it happen. It's about how no one listened when we tried to speak up." Community activists rallied around the families, calling for greater accountability and systemic reforms. Their demands echoed those heard in protests across the nation. Implicit bias training for healthcare workers, stricter oversight in NICUs, and greater representation of Black professionals in medicine. Strotman's actions were heinous, but they also exposed the cracks in a healthcare system that has long been criticized for its treatment of Black families. Hospitals are supposed to be sanctuaries of healing, but for too many Black patients, they are places of fear and inequity. The case of Henrico Children's Hospital was not just about one nurse's crimes. It was a stark reminder that systemic racism can have devastating consequences, even in places where lives are meant to be saved. As the investigation into Erin Strotman continued, the community's outrage only grew. The question wasn't just about what she did. It was about how she was able to do it for so long, and why the system failed to protect those who needed it most. The racial disparities weren't a coincidence. They were a call to action. But would this case finally force the changes so desperately needed? Or would it be yet another chapter in a long, painful history of injustice? In December 2024, after months of mounting pressure, Erin Strotman was arrested and charged with felony child abuse. The arrest brought some sense of relief to the devastated families, but it also sparked a wider reckoning. Strotman's actions did not just ruin lives. They exposed the cracks in a system that was supposed to protect the most vulnerable. Families had lost trust in the hospital, and the hospital itself was now forced to face its failures. But Strotman's arrest was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. A conversation about medical racism, systemic bias, and the need for urgent change. News outlets across the country were buzzing with the story. Erin Strotman's arrest was a moment that seemed to bring an end to the nightmare for many of the families. But for them, it was never really about the arrest, it was about the loss. The trauma their children endured was irreplaceable, and the emotional scars were deeper than anyone could fully comprehend. Courtroom footage, if available, would show the pain in the eyes of the families as they watched Strotman being led away in handcuffs. They wanted justice, but they also wanted answers. How could someone entrusted with the care of innocent babies commit such horrific acts? Dominique Hakey, the father of one of the injured infants, stepped forward, speaking to the press with a voice cracked with emotion. "My son's bones were broken by the person we trusted to keep him safe," he said, his voice trembling. "We fought to bring our children into this world, and now we're fighting to heal them. Not just physically, but emotionally." Other families followed, sharing their stories of hope turned to heartbreak. Their children were supposed to be cared for, to be nurtured back to health in the safest place possible. But for too many of them, the NICU became a place of terror, where those who should have been the protectors became the perpetrators. As public outrage grew, Henrico Children's Hospital had no choice but to respond. Hospital officials, once silent, now spoke out. They announced immediate reforms to ensure such an atrocity would never happen again. Stricter monitoring of the NICU, enhanced staff training, and the implementation of zero-tolerance policies for abuse were all part of the new protocol. But these changes were too little, too late for the families who had already suffered. Still, experts warned that these reforms, while necessary, were not enough. They called for systemic change in healthcare, a movement to address the root causes of medical racism that had long plagued the system. It wasn't just about improving one hospital or implementing better policies in one ward. It was about overhauling an entire system that had, for far too long, allowed implicit bias to go unchecked. As the story of Erin Strotman spread, it sparked a nationwide conversation online. Activists and concerned citizens took to social media, calling for justice and highlighting the issue of medical racism. Doctors, sociologists, and healthcare professionals discussed the broader implications of what had happened at Henrico Children's Hospital. The issue of medical racism, the bias against Black patients, particularly in the most vulnerable of circumstances, came to the forefront of public debate. Though Strotman was arrested, the systemic issues within the healthcare industry remained. A report by the National Medical Association highlighted that Black patients often received less pain management, less accurate diagnoses, and fewer opportunities for effective care compared to their white counterparts. Experts spoke out about the deadly consequences of these disparities. "The problem isn't just individual acts of abuse like Strotman's," said Dr. Kimberly Hughes, a sociologist who specializes in healthcare inequality. "It's a system that is built on inequality. It's a system that views Black lives as expendable." As Erin Strotman faces her trial, and the families of her victims continue their fight for justice, the question remains, what happens next? Can we truly fix a healthcare system that is broken at its core? The arrest of one nurse, no matter how significant, is not the end of the battle. it's only the beginning. How can we protect the most vulnerable when the system that was supposed to care for them is built on a foundation of mistrust and neglect? The case of Erin Strotman is a chilling reminder of the vulnerability that exists within our healthcare system. It exposes a truth many are unwilling to confront: that prejudice, often unspoken and unseen, can creep into even the most trusted spaces. But as horrifying as this case is, it serves as a powerful call to action. The families whose lives were shattered by Strotman's actions will never fully heal. They will carry the scars of this betrayal for the rest of their lives. But the real tragedy is that, for so many, the pain they endured wasn't just a result of one nurse's cruelty. It was the consequence of a system that failed them long before Strotman's actions were uncovered. This is not an isolated incident. The issue of medical racism, of bias against Black patients, particularly Black infants, is a pervasive problem that continues to affect countless families. It's a systemic issue that doesn't just end with one person's arrest. Erin Strotman may face the consequences of her actions, but the fight for justice extends far beyond this case. We must ask ourselves, how many more families have suffered in silence? How many more victims have been ignored or mistreated in the name of prejudice? This is not just a matter of healthcare reform. It's about our values as a society. It's about recognizing the humanity in every patient, regardless of their race, and ensuring that all families receive the care they deserve. This is a fight that requires all of us. It's a fight for equality, for justice, and for a future where no child, no family, suffers in silence because of the color of their skin. Hospitals must be held accountable. Lawmakers must take action, and society as a whole must rise to the occasion. The fight against medical racism is far from over. But together we can change the system. Together, we can create a world where every patient is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. A world where no one has to fear for the safety of their child in a hospital bed. If you found this story compelling, if it moved you to think, to reflect, to take action, then share it. Subscribe to this channel. Join us in the fight for justice and equity in healthcare. Together,